Miss Marple, The Vanishing of Violet Grey Part 1, A Stranger Among Roses, voice soft, reflective, the faint sound of church bells in the distance. It is often said that nothing ever happens in St. Mary Mead, but I have long believed that in a quiet village, the most curious things often unfold, quietly, politely, and under the scent of blooming roses. It was the summer of 1952, and St. Mary Mead was at its loveliest. The lawns were a quilt of sunlight and shadow, the hedges neatly trimmed, and the air faintly laced with the perfume of honeysuckle and sweet peas. Life moved at the pace of the church clock, slow, predictable, and comforting, until, that is, Miss Violet Grey arrived, and no one could quite agree on how the actress found her way to our village. Some said she had inherited a cottage from an aunt. Others whispered that she was hiding from a scandal or a lover or something far worse. What was certain was that Violet Grey did not belong in St. Mary Mead, and her arrival caused more talk than the bishop's sermon ever could. She came one golden morning in a chauffeur-driven motor car, stepping out in a hat far too fashionable for our lanes, her lips a perfect red curve, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, who fancied herself immune to vanity, could not resist staring. "Actress or not," murmured Mrs. Hartnell at the grocer's, "no woman wears silk gloves in this heat unless she's hiding something." Violet took residence at Willowbank Cottage, a small, ivy-covered house in a lane that led toward the old mill. The cottage had been empty since Colonel Braithwaite's death, and many of us had grown used to passing it with a mild shiver. Yet, with Violet's arrival, its windows glowed once again, and the faint sound of piano music drifted across the hedgerows at dusk. Miss Marple noticed, of course. She noticed everything. "My day," she said to me one afternoon over tea. "People often say they wish for excitement, but when it comes, it is rarely the kind they imagine." The first time I saw Violet Grey was at the vicarage garden party. She stood near the croquet lawn, perfectly poised, her laughter bright and silvery, though her eyes seemed oddly distant. She was talking to Mr. Leonard Walsh, the art critic who had retired from London. They made quite the picture, the jaded critic and the fading star-dot Mrs. Bantry whispered that he had once written a rather cool review of Violet's last play. The tragedy of Miss Grey, it had been titled. The irony, it seemed, was not lost on anyone. By late afternoon, half the village had found a reason to drift past her, to admire, to gossip, or to catch her scent, which was of lilies and cigarette smoke. Even Colonel Bartlett, who never noticed anything beyond his own whiskey glass, remarked that she was a fine-looking woman, if a trifle too knowing. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly beneath the chestnut tree, was watching something else. Her blue eyes followed the subtle glances, the looks exchanged between Violet and a tall, dark-haired man standing by the lemonade table. His name was Peter Layton, a struggling playwright said to be on the verge of success for the last decade. Few in the village liked him. He was charming in conversation, but curiously cold in manner. That day, though, he and Violet seemed caught in some unspoken current, one that made Miss Marple's knitting needles pause mid-air. "It is rather touching," she murmured, "how people think old age dulls one's sight. I see far too much." As the weeks passed, Violet settled into village life, or rather, she performed it. She joined the church choir, though she never came to practice, sent baskets of fruit to the vicarage, which turned out to be bought from Fortnum's, and smiled her way into every sitting room. Yet beneath the gracious manners, something simmered. She was often seen walking alone at twilight, her letters sent by registered post, her telephone calls brief and always behind closed doors. When asked about her work, she would smile faintly and say, "One never truly leaves a stage, my dear. One merely changes the audience." Then, one night, she vanished. It was the evening before her long-rumoured return to the stage, a one-night charity performance to be held at the village hall. The posters, printed in elegant red script, read, "Violet Grey returns, a night of drama and delight." That morning, Violet had seemed uncharacteristically quiet. Mrs. Bantry, who called in with a bouquet of roses, found her pale and distracted. "Stage fright," she said with a nervous laugh. "Imagine, after all these years." That evening, the hall was abuzz. The seats were full, the candles glimmered, and the whole of St. Mary Mead turned out to witness the event. But as the clock struck 8, there was no sign of Violet. At half past, Peter Layton went backstage to fetch her. He returned, white-faced. "She isn't there," he whispered. "She's gone." The curtain rose on an empty stage. Later, when the police arrived, they found her dressing room in perfect order, except for three peculiar details. 1. A broken mirror, shards glittering on the vanity point. 2. A half-written letter, addressed simply to "My dearest," and ending mid-sentence. Point 3. A single glove, silk, faintly perfumed, resting on the floor. No footprints, no sign of struggle. Only absence and the faint scent of lilies that lingered long after she was gone. The village awoke to a storm of speculation. Some swore she had eloped. Others insisted she had met with foul play. Inspector Drew from Much Benham was called in, brisk and efficient as ever, declaring, "She's a woman with a past. My money's on her running away from it again." But Miss Marple merely smiled her small, knowing smile. "My dear Inspector," she said gently, "you may be quite right that, or perhaps, as in so many plays, the lady's final act was not the one we expected." She glanced toward the broken mirror as the constables packed away the evidence. "You see," she added softly, "a broken reflection often tells us more about the truth than a perfect one ever could." And with that, she returned to her knitting, but her eyes were far away, as if seeing something none of us yet could. Soft fade out, the sound of wind through trees, and the ticking of a clock. Clap aboard, Miss Marple. The Vanishing of Violet Grey. Part 2. Secrets in the Smoke. Opening with the soft hiss of morning tea being poured. The tone is hushed, thoughtful, slightly foreboding. The morning after a disappearance is rather like the morning after a storm. The world looks the same, yet one cannot shake the sense that something has been altered quietly and forever. The disappearance of Miss Violet Grey had spread through St. Mary Mead faster than the scent of honeysuckle in June. By breakfast, every sitting room hummed with speculation. By luncheon, it had taken on the authority of gospel. Mrs. Bantry, who prided herself on being helpful to the authorities, declared that Violet had most certainly been abducted. "No lady leaves her gloves behind voluntarily," she insisted. Meanwhile, Mrs. Price Ridley took the darker view. "Mark my words, it's suicide. Theatrical people are always doing it for attention." And yet, the truth, as Miss Marple quietly observed, rarely follows the loudest voice. That morning, Miss Marple took her customary walk along the lane toward Willowbank Cottage. The mist still clung low over the hedgerows, and the grass was silver with dew. The gate stood ajar. She paused, not out of fear, but curiosity. The little cottage, once so alive with music, now seemed utterly still. On the table by the window lay a pile of unopened envelopes, all bearing the same neat handwriting. Bills, perhaps, or letters from someone Violet had not wished to hear from. On the mantelpiece, a photograph, Violet, younger, radiant, standing beside a man whose face had been cut neatly out of the frame. "How very tidy," murmured Miss Marple. "Almost too tidy." In the grate were the ashes of several burned papers, recent, by the smell. Miss Marple bent to look more closely. Among the grey remains, she found a small fragment of gold-embossed paper. It read only, "Theatre Royal, Bath." By the time she returned to the village, the police had taken over the matter entirely. Inspector Drew, all brisk moustache and sensible boots, was not a man who welcomed interference. "Now then, Miss Marple," he said with a polite but weary smile, "I do appreciate your interest, but this is hardly a case of lost cats or pilfered teaspoons." The lady was a London actress, and I have a feeling her affairs are rather theatrical. "Indeed, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly, "human nature does tend to perform, regardless of the stage." The inspector frowned, but Miss Marple had already turned away, her mind busy with patterns only she could see. The official story, as reported in the Daily Gazette 2 days later, was simple enough. Violet Grey, 42, stage actress of some repute, had vanished from her dressing room shortly before performance. No sign of foul play was found. The police suspected she had fled the village, perhaps to France. It was neat. It was tidy. It was, Miss Marple thought, entirely wrong. "You see," she told me that evening as we sat before the fire, "people rarely vanish neatly. The world is full of clumsy edges. When something appears perfectly arranged, it's often because someone has done the arranging." She paused, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "And then there is that peculiar matter of the mirror." I asked her what she meant. "A broken mirror, my dear, is a dangerous symbol. In old tales, it meant the shattering of the self. But in real life," she smiled faintly, "it often means someone wished not to see what was reflected." That same evening, a small meeting took place at the Blue Boar Inn, the only establishment in St. Mary Mead that offered both gossip and gin. Among the attendees were Peter Layton, the playwright, Leonard Walsh, the critic, and Mrs. Bantry, who had somehow just happened to stop by. Miss Marple, of course, did not attend, but she heard the substance of their conversation the very next morning. In St. Mary Mead, nothing remained private for long. According to Peter Layton, Violet had been blackmailed. "She told me as much," he said darkly. Someone from her past had found her here. Someone she feared. Leonard Walsh was unconvinced. Nonsense. She was restless. She wanted London again, the lights, the applause. A woman like that doesn't vanish. She simply takes her bow and changes scenes. They quarreled, of course. Layton stormed out. Walsh stayed for another drink, muttering about the tragedy of egos. And all the while, unnoticed by either, the innkeeper's boy carried their empty glasses away, glasses that smelled faintly, curiously, of Violet's perfume. A few days later, something peculiar occurred. A letter arrived at the post office, addressed in Violet's handwriting, but postmarked 3 days after her disappearance. The envelope was forwarded to Inspector Drew, who read it aloud at the vicarage, where Miss Marple was quietly darning socks. "My dearest," it began, "I cannot explain everything, but I beg you to forgive me. The past is caught up, and I must go where it cannot follow. You will understand, one day, why it had to be this way." There was no signature, no address, only a faint smudge of powder on the paper, rose-scented, unmistakably violets. The inspector closed the letter with a sigh. "A farewell note if ever I saw one. We'll list her as missing presumed voluntary." Miss Marple, however, said nothing. She merely examined the letter's edge, noticing a small brown fleck, tobacco ash, pipe ash, to be precise. Not Violet style at all. "Curious," she murmured, "particularly as there are only 3 pipe smokers in St. Mary Mead, and only one who uses a rather Turkish blend." 2 evenings later, she paid a quiet visit to Mr. Leonard Walsh's cottage. He was startled to see her at the door, but managed to smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, come to talk theatre, have you?" "Not quite," she replied sweetly. "I wondered if you might help me identify something. A photograph, perhaps." From her bag she drew a fragment of the burned picture she had found, the one from Violet's mantelpiece. Walsh stiffened. "Where did you find that?" "Among the ashes of Willowbank Cottage," she said softly. "You see, Mr. Walsh, it seems Violet was rather fond of destroying reminders of the past." For a moment he said nothing. Then he laughed, a short, dry sound. "We were close once, years ago, before her fame, before everything. But she ended it. She always did enjoy her dramas." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And yet you followed her here." He stared at her, jaw tight. "You think I—" "Good heavens, Miss Marple, I'm not a murderer." "I didn't say you were," she replied calmly, "only that you seem rather determined to prove it." That night, smoke was seen rising from the rear of Walsh's garden. The constable on duty, passing by, found him burning a stack of papers, old letters, he said, for an unfortunate chapter. When asked what they contained, he smiled thinly. "Only memories, Inspector. And memories, as Miss Marple says, are dangerous things." The next morning brought rain, and a revelation. While trimming his hedges near the old mill, Tom Bartlett, the gardener, found something wedged beneath the reeds by the stream, a silver compact mirror, its clasp engraved with the initials VG. It was intact, not broken, and inside, faintly visible beneath a dusting of powder, was a single crimson fingerprint. Inspector Drew called it inconclusive. Miss Marple called it impossible. "You see, my dear," she explained, "if Violet's mirror was broken in her dressing room, how is it that another identical, but unbroken, lies half a mile away in a field, unless, of course, someone wished us to believe the mirror had been broken. She looked thoughtful. It reminds me, she said softly, of poor Mrs. Weatherby, who once pretended to lose her wedding ring so she could accuse her husband's secretary of theft. One should always ask who benefits from a disappearance, and who looks rather too pleased about it. And then came the moment that changed everything. That evening, while the village huddled indoors against the rain, Peter Layton was found unconscious in his cottage. A bottle of brandy lay spilled beside him, the air thick with fumes. A suicide note, scrawled in haste, read, "Forgive me, I could not bear what I had done." The inspector declared the matter settled. The playwright, driven by guilt and rejection, had killed Violet and taken his own life. But Miss Marple, standing by the window, shook her head slowly. "No, Inspector," she said quietly, "you are missing the performance's final act." "And what's that supposed to mean, Miss Marple?" "Only that when the curtain falls too neatly, one should always suspect the stage manager." Soft fade, rain on windows, and the faint toll of the church clock. Part 3. The Mirror's Second Face. Soft opening. The faint ticking of a clock, rain fading into the sound of birdsong. Miss Marple's voice, steady, introspective. "It is a curious thing how swiftly people settle into comfort after tragedy. The village, having been most satisfyingly stirred by scandal, now seemed determined to forget it. But memory, you know, is not so easily commanded. The day after Peter Layton's death, St. Mary Mead was subdued, though not silent. By noon, every sitting-room had its theory. Mrs. Bantry's was most widely accepted, that the poor playwright, consumed by guilt over Miss Gray's death, had taken the coward's way out. A dreadful thing, of course, she told me over tea cakes. But then, artistic types always were so emotional. It's in their nature, you know. Miss Marple, who was pouring the tea, gave one of her small, serene smiles. "Yes, dear, though I've always found emotion, when properly understood, to be the least of human dangers. Conceit, however, conceit can kill quite quietly." She said nothing more then, but I could see she was thinking, turning over details like pebbles in her mind, searching for one that did not fit. That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Inspector Drew. He was, as usual, brisk and unamused by interference. "I don't suppose you come to congratulate us, Miss Marple? Case closed. Confession, suicide, all neat and tidy." "Neatness," said Miss Marple mildly, "is a great virtue in embroidery, Inspector. In motor, I find it somewhat suspect." He sighed. "If you have a theory, I'd be glad to hear it, though I warn you, the evidence is perfectly clear." Miss Marple looked at him with kind patience, as one might regard a bright but overconfident child. "Evidence," she said softly, "is rarely clear, Inspector. It is only made to appear so by those who wish to guide our eyes in a certain direction." And she told him of the mirror. The first, broken one, found in the dressing-room, and the second, unbroken one, discovered near the stream. Two mirrors, Inspector, one to suggest violence, the other to suggest escape. But perhaps, together, they show us something quite different. Inspector Drew frowned. "Are you suggesting someone planted them both?" "Not both," she said gently. "Just one. The wrong one." Miss Marple left the station and walked slowly down the lane, her umbrella tapping softly on the cobblestones. Her mind was busy, piecing together small, human puzzles. A burned photograph, a letter that arrived too late, pipe ash where it should not have been, and above all, the performance that never took place. "People often say," she murmured to herself, "that the show must go on. But in this case, it seems the curtain was drawn too soon." That evening, the vicarage hosted a small supper for the village committee, postponed from the night of the performance. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled of wet earth and roses. Present were Mrs. Bantry, Colonel Bartlett, Leonard Walsh, and, at Miss Marple's gentle invitation, Dr. Reed, the local physician. It was a modest affair, but tension lay thick beneath the politeness. Colonel Bartlett raised his glass. A sad business, the whole thing, he said gruffly. Still, best not to dwell on it. Life moves on. Leonard Walsh gave a thin smile. Indeed, though in my experience, Colonel, the dead have an unfortunate habit of lingering. There was a small silence, broken only by the sound of Miss Marple's knitting needles. It's remarkable, she said softly, how tragedy changes people's habits. Mr. Walsh, you've taken up smoking again, I see. He stiffened. I beg your pardon. Your fingers, she explained mildly. They have the faintest yellow stain. Turkish tobacco, if I'm not mistaken. Such a distinctive scent. One notices it easily, especially when reading letters that smell faintly of roses. The table went very still. Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple? Walsh demanded, his face pale. Not at all, she said gently. Merely observing. It's what old ladies do best. After the guests had gone, the vicar turned to her in confusion. My dear Miss Marple, you seemed almost to be baiting poor Walsh. Yes, she said, setting down her tea. I needed to see how he would react. He is a man who values appearances, perhaps more than truth. He reminds me of Mrs. Weatherby's nephew, who once forged his uncle's will and grew quite indignant when accused. Always a bad sign. The vicar sighed. You think Walsh killed Violet? Miss Marple shook her head. Oh, no. I think he's done something quite different, and perhaps equally cruel. The following morning, a peculiar rumor began to circulate. Violet Grey had been seen. A woman matching her description had been spotted at a roadside 10 miles away, asking for a lift to London. Inspector Drew was triumphant. There you have it, Miss Marple. The lady's alive and well, probably laughing at us all. But Miss Marple's eyes remained thoughtful. It's a comforting notion, isn't it, to imagine her alive? Still, I wonder, do you suppose an actress like Violet Grey would ever leave without her jewels? For indeed, when her cottage had been searched, her collection of diamond clips and pearl earrings was found untouched in their velvet case, left behind like trinkets forgotten on a dressing table. No, said Miss Marple softly. I rather think Violet Grey left in a hurry, only not of her own choosing. Later that day, Miss Marple took a quiet detour by the old mill pond, where the second mirror had been found. The reeds were whispering in the breeze, and dragonflies darted over the surface like fragments of glass. She paused. Something caught her eye, a faint shimmer in the mud. She stooped, brushing aside the weeds, and lifted a silver bracelet, tarnished and delicate, engraved inside with the words, "To VG for our first curtain call. P.L. Peter Layton's initials." That evening, she paid a visit to Dr. Reed, who lived in the neat little house by the green. He welcomed her in, offering tea. "You were close to Miss Grey, I believe?" she asked gently. "Only professionally," he replied. "She had a touch of insomnia, nothing more. I prescribed her bromide tablets. Perfectly harmless." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, bromide, a sedative, but hardly lethal. Curious, did you ever give her any injections?" "Good heavens, no." "Ah, then perhaps someone else did." Before he could respond, she rose. "Thank you, Doctor. You've been most kind. One learns so much from talking to people, and from what they don't say." That night, Miss Marple could not sleep. She sat by her window, the village hushed beneath the moonlight. "Two mirrors," she murmured, "one broken, one whole. A letter posted late. A death too convenient. It is also very staged." Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap. "If this were one of Violet's plays," she whispered, "there would be a final twist, the moment when the mask slips. And I think," her eyes narrowed, "the mask is about to slip indeed." The following morning brought a small but decisive event. The vicarage maid, young Elsie, came running to Miss Marple with wide eyes. I was cleaning the stage room in the hall, and found this under the curtain rail." It was a tiny glass vial, the sort used for theatrical makeup or perfume. Inside, a trace of pale powder shimmered faintly. Miss Marple turned it in the light. "Interesting. Not makeup, I think. Not perfume either, but something rather cleverer. She placed it carefully in her reticule. You see, my dear, she told me later, there are poisons that act not when swallowed, but when combined. Alone, quite harmless. Together, deadly. You mean? Exactly. A performance of chemistry. You might say, one substance hidden in plain sight. The other, perhaps, in something as innocent as face powder. Or a silk glove. And then she added softly, almost to herself, I believe Violet Grey never left St. Mary Mead at all. Soft fade, the ticking of a clock, distant thunder rolling. Part 4. A Truth in Fragments. The following morning dawned pale and uncertain, with a kind of thin sunlight that seemed to apologize for the night before. The air in St. Mary Mead held a damp chill, and though the garden behind the vicarage was bright with dew, there was a heaviness that hung over the village, the kind that comes only when something has been taken away that cannot be replaced. Mrs. Violet Grey was still missing. By breakfast, the newspapers had begun to arrive from London, carrying the story like wildfire. Stage star vanishes in village mystery, read one bold headline. The villagers, of course, were both scandalized and delighted. They spoke of it in the post office, in the bakery, and even during morning prayers. It was as if the small, tidy streets of St. Mary Mead had been plucked up and dropped straight into the pages of detective novel. But for Miss Marple, it was no story at all. It was simply human nature, wearing one of its familiar masks. She was seated by the window, knitting a soft gray shawl, when I brought in her tea. Her eyes were distant, watching the road toward the meadow. Have you noticed, she said softly, that people rarely vanish completely? Oh, they may think they do, but there's always a thread left behind. The trouble is, most people never see it for what it is. She took her tea without sugar, as usual. Later that morning, Inspector Graves called at the vicarage. He looked weary and rather out of place among the lace doilies and flowered wallpaper. He had been up since dawn organizing searches through the woods and along the nearby riverbanks. There's not a trace of her, he said grimly. No sign she ever left the cottage at all. Her suitcase, her handbag, all still there. Miss Marple tilted her head. And the letter? Still missing, he said, though I have a feeling it was never meant to be sent. She regarded him kindly, as though encouraging a child to think aloud. You believe someone took it? I believe, said the inspector, lowering his voice, that someone wanted her silence. The question is, who and why? He handed her a small evidence envelope. Inside was a single item, a fragment of glass from the broken mirror in Violet's dressing room. It was faintly smudged with red. Blood, he said, and not much of it, but enough to prove something happened there. Miss Marple looked at the shard for a long time. The reflection of the morning light danced across her face like ripples of water. You see, she murmured, the mirror tells us a great deal, if one listens properly. That afternoon, I accompanied her to Violet Grey's cottage. It stood still and silent, the roses on the trellis already beginning to droop. Inside, the faint scent of violet powder lingered, soft, cloying, and oddly sad. Miss Marple examined everything. The dressing table, the open trunk, the half-eaten biscuit on the saucer by the window. It was like stepping into a frozen moment of time. She was preparing to leave, Miss Marple said, almost herself. But not for long. No, she was dressing for an arrival, not a departure. I looked at her, puzzled. She gestured toward the gown laid out on the bed, a shimmering silver evening dress. That isn't what a woman wears when she plans to disappear. That's what she wears when she expects to be seen. Then she looked at the cracked mirror. But someone shattered that reflection, didn't they? As we turned to leave, a knock came at the door. It was young Peter Hargreaves, the aspiring writer who had been so eager to speak with Violet about her memoirs. His expression was drawn, almost fearful. I thought I might help, he stammered. She trusted me, you see. I came by last evening, after the lights went out. But, Miss Marple interrupted gently, after the lights went out? He swallowed. Yes, I saw someone leaving her garden gate around 10:30. I thought it was Mrs. Pargeter. She wears the same sort of hat. But now I'm not so sure. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she considered this. And you told no one. I didn't want to get involved, he said helplessly. Ah, said Miss Marple. That is how so many tragedies persist, through the kindness of silence. The next clue arrived not through evidence, but gossip. At tea, Mrs. Podgster could not resist telling me what she'd heard from her cousin in the next parish, that Violet Grey had once been engaged to a London producer named Bernard Llewellyn, who had died mysteriously just before their wedding. Some said suicide, others something darker. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. How curious, she murmured, that death should so often follow in her shadow, and yet how ordinary, really. People are so rarely as new as they appear to be. Then she rose, her movement slow but purposeful. Come, my dear, we must pay a visit to Mr. Summers. Mr. Summers was a solicitor who had handled Violet's affairs during her brief stay in the village. His office smelled of dust and old ink, and his manner was dry as paper. He was startled to see Miss Marple and me arrive unannounced, but her reputation in St. Mary Mead was such that few dared refuse her conversation. Miss Grey, he said, adjusting his spectacles, was a client of mine. Yes, she intended to alter her will, but it was never completed. She wished to leave a considerable portion to someone unexpected. May I ask who? Miss Marple said, her voice soft but sharp. He hesitated. To Mrs. Cartwright, the housekeeper who tended her late father's home in Hampstead, a woman she'd not seen in 20 years. Miss Marple nodded, as though a small piece of her inner puzzle had just clicked into place. Family ties, she murmured. Even when stretched thin, they have a way of snapping back. When we left the office, the air outside was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and rain. The village clock struck 5, echoing across the green. Miss Marple paused by the gate. Do you remember, she said suddenly, that little case of the quiet girl and the broken cameo brooch? I smiled faintly. You mean the one where the culprit left no trace, yet the truth was hiding in the reflection of a teacup? Precisely, she said. Mirrors are tricky things. My dear, they show us what we want to see and conceal what we cannot bear to face. She looked back toward Violet Grey's cottage, and I think our vanished actress knew that all too well. That evening, as the church bells tolled vespers, a messenger from police arrived with a curious item found near the edge of the woods. A torn piece of silver fabric and a locket engraved with the initials VG inside was a photograph, not of Violet, but of a man. The face was striking, handsome, confident, with a faint scar across the temple. Miss Marple held it close to the lamplight, and for a moment her expression turned grave. I knew it, she whispered. The past is never truly gone. It only changes costume. As I looked at her, I felt the weight of her understanding, that quiet certainty she always carried, even when others were still fumbling in the dark. She turned to me with a faint smile. Tomorrow, she said, we shall visit the old boathouse by the river. I have a feeling our poor Violet may be waiting there, though not, I fear, in the way we hope. And with that, she returned to her knitting, the steady rhythm of her needles like the ticking of time itself, patient, precise, and unrelenting. Part 5. The Face Beneath the Mask. Dawn came shrouded in mist, drifting across the meadows like breath over glass. The village was unnaturally quiet. Even the birds seemed subdued, their songs softened to a kind of mourning. At the vicarage, Miss Marple was already awake. Her teacup sat untouched beside her, the knitting folded neatly in her lap. She was thinking, not about wool weather, but about mirrors, ribbons, and the curious persistence of the past. The thing about truth, my dear, she said at last, as I entered the room, is that it rarely announces itself. It hides, not in the shadows, but in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice the smallest, most ordinary thing. She looked up at me, her blue eyes bright as candlelight. I believe we shall find Violet Grey today. By the time we reached the river, the mist had begun to lift. The old boathouse stood at the edge of the reeds, half-sunken and forgotten. Its timbers creaked softly in the morning air. A constable stood nearby, cap in hand, looking distinctly uneasy. Inside, the smell was of rot and stagnant water. And there, beneath a canvas sheet, lay what had once been Violet Grey. Her silver dress was torn and mudded, the shimmer of its fabric dulled by the damp. Her hands were folded against her chest as if in prayer, and her face, pale, serene, strangely untouched, seemed to wear the faintest trace of sorrow rather than fear. Inspector Graves was already there. "Drowned," he said curtly. "Likely slipped in last night. The current would have dragged her under." Miss Marple shook her head, very slightly. "No," she said. "Not the current. Not this river." He frowned. "Then what do you mean?" She bent closer, pointing to a faint mark on the inside of Violet's wrist, a bruise, shaped like fingers. "She was held," Miss Marple murmured. "Held, and then released when it was too late." The discovery silenced the village. For all their gossip, the villagers of St. Mary Mead were not cruel. They whispered now with genuine sadness. At the church, the vicar said prayers for Violet's soul, though few had truly known her. And yet, there was one person who seemed untouched by grief. Mr. Summers, the solicitor, appeared more nervous than sorrowful. He avoided Miss Marple at every opportunity. When she finally cornered him outside the post office, his composure faltered. "You knew," she said quietly, "that Violet Grey had changed her will." He stammered. She hadn't signed it. It was meaningless." "Meaningless to you, perhaps," Miss Marple replied, "but not to the person it named." She fixed him with that gentle, unrelenting gaze of haze. "You see, Mr. Summers, Violet's mother was not who she claimed to be. She was born in this very village, the daughter of a woman named Martha Cartwright." His eyes widened. "Mrs. Cartwright," Miss Marple went on, "was also housekeeper to a certain Colonel Cartwright in Hampstead, Violet's guardian after her father died. I believe Mrs. Cartwright was more than a servant. She was Violet's true mother." He swallowed. "You can't possibly." "Oh, but I can," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "because Violet was not leaving her money to an old housekeeper. She was leaving it to her mother, a woman who never stopped loving her, though she was made to live in shame." That evening, Miss Marple invited Inspector Graves and several of the villagers to tea at the vicarage. The table was neatly set, the air thick with quiet expectation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we have all been asking the wrong question. Not who killed Violet Grey, but why she had to die now." She turned to Peter Hargreaves, the young writer. "You said you saw someone leaving her cottage the night she disappeared. You thought it was Mrs. Pargeter." He nodded nervously. "But it wasn't Mrs. Pargeter," Miss Marple said. "It was someone wearing her hat, someone who wished to appear harmless, respectable, invisible." Her gaze shifted toward the solicitor, Mr. Summers. "You knew Violet was preparing to sign her new will," she said. "And you knew what it meant for you, the loss of control, the end of a profitable arrangement. So you came to her that night, hoping to persuade her otherwise. When persuasion failed, you resorted to something far worse." Summers's lips trembled. "This is absurd." But Miss Marple went on, her voice calm and inexorable. "You struck her. She fell, breaking the mirror. When she came to, you panicked. You took her down to the river, perhaps hoping to frighten her, to make it seem a tragic accident. But Violet fought, not for her life, but for the truth. And in that struggle, she drowned." The room was utterly silent. Summers stood rigid, his face ashen. "You have no proof," he whispered. Miss Marple smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Only human proof. You see, in her final moment, Violet clutched something in her hand, a piece of her dress torn away in the struggle. The fabric bears a thread of your cuff, Mr. Summers. A fine blue thread, from the very jacket you wear now." When the police took him away, there was no triumph in Miss Marple's expression, only a quiet melancholy. She sat back in her chair and looked toward the window, where the last of the sunlight flickered through the rose vines. "I never liked these endings," she said softly. "People always imagine justice as something clean and satisfying. But it never is. It's rather like pruning roses. Necessary, yes, but it always leaves a stain." Violet Grey was buried in the churchyard 3 days later. Few attended, save Miss Marple, the vicar, and myself. A single white lily lay across her coffin, placed there by Mrs. Cartwright, who had arrived quietly from London after the news reached her. She wept silently, and Miss Marple took her hand in gentle understanding. When the last clod of earth had fallen, the older woman whispered, "She was my joy and my punishment." Miss Marple squeezed her hand. "Love," she said, "so often is both." That evening, the village began to return to its usual rhythms. The chatter of the grocers, the clang of the church bell, the faint smell of scones from the vicarage kitchen. I found Miss Marple once more by her window, knitting as the dusk fell. "Do you suppose," I asked, "that Violet was happy here, before all this?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "Happiness," she said slowly, "is a fragile thing, my dear. It depends not on what we have, but on what we can bear to remember." She looked out toward the meadow, where the evening fog was creeping in once more. Poor Violet thought she could escape her past by pretending to be someone else. But one can never quite put off one's old self, can one? It follows, like a reflection, even when the mirror breaks. And then she smiled, faint, wistful, unshaken. "Still," she said, "perhaps she's found peace now. I do hope so." The clock chimed softly, and the village settled into sleep once more, its secrets tucked safely beneath the scent of roses, its truths known only to one small, elderly lady who saw everything and said very little. Part 6. Echoes in the Glass. The days that followed Violet Gray's funeral passed with a strange stillness, as though the village itself were taking a breath, hesitant, unsure what to say after so much had been revealed. The world beyond St. Mary Mead soon moved on, of course. London's newspapers turned their attention to newer scandals, fresher faces. But here, amid the lanes and gardens, Violet's absence remained, like perfume lingering in an empty room. Miss Marple, as always, resumed her ordinary routine. She tended to her roses, wrote polite notes of thanks to the ladies who had sent her shortbread, and visited old Mrs. Price in the infirmary every Wednesday. And yet, I could sense that her thoughts still wandered, not to the crime itself, but to the lives it had touched and what might have been. That evening, I found her in her parlor, her lamp casting a pool of golden light over her knitting. She was listening to the faint sound of the wireless from next door, a broadcast of some theatrical program. For a moment, I thought I saw her smile at the familiar voice of an actress reciting a passage from The Tempest. "She had a gift for words, you know," Miss Marple said softly. "Violet Gray. Not just on stage, but in life. She knew how to make people feel as she wished them to, admired, desired, forgiven." She placed her knitting down and looked out the window, where dusk gathered in violet tones. "But that is a dangerous sort of magic, my dear. The world never forgives a woman who learns it too well." It was 2 days later when a letter arrived, forwarded from Violet's London address. The envelope was thin, the handwriting elegant but slightly uneven. It had been posted the night before she vanished. Miss Marple opened it with delicate care, reading it silently first, then passing it to me. It was addressed to Mrs. Cartwright. "Dearest Mother, I have thought long about what you said. I will make things right, for both of us. Tomorrow I shall sign the papers and put an end to all this secrecy. Then I will come to you, no longer Violet Gray, the actress, but simply your daughter. With love, always, Emily." I looked up, startled. "Emily." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Her real name, I imagine. Violet Gray was merely the part she played to survive. But Emily Cartwright, that was who she truly was. She folded the letter gently and tucked it back into its envelope. "It's remarkable," she said, almost to herself, "how often the desire to start again brings about one's undoing. We tell ourselves that a new name, a new place, a new beginning will make us different. But the past is always watching, waiting for its cue." That Sunday, after the morning service, several villagers lingered by the lich gate, speaking in subdued tones about the tragedy. Mrs. Pargeter, of course, had the final word. "Well," she sniffed, "I always say that sort of glamour never lasts. Poor woman, all that beauty and all those secrets. It's bound to end badly." Miss Marple, passing by with her hymn book, gave a small smile. "Oh, I don't know, Mrs. Pargeter. Perhaps beauty fades, but kindness doesn't. And as for secrets, well, we all have a few, don't we?" Mrs. Podgiter flushed and pretended not to hear. That afternoon, the sun returned, bright and forgiving. Miss Marple invited me to take tea in her garden. The air smelled of honeysuckle and cut grass. A bee hummed lazily among the roses. "Do you ever tire of it?" I asked her suddenly. These unpleasant discoveries, seeing so much darkness beneath such ordinary lives. She stirred her tea thoughtfully. "No," she said after a pause. "Not darkness, exactly. Just people being what they are, frightened, proud, lonely. We all want something, you see, to be loved, to be admired, to be forgiven. That's what leads to all the trouble." She smiled faintly. "But I do wish sometimes that people could learn to be content with a little less drama. Life provides enough of it without our help." Then she added, in a deceptively mild tone, "Still, I suppose if everyone behaved perfectly, I'd have nothing to do." We both laughed quietly, though the sound held a trace of sadness. As the shadows lengthened, I noticed a small framed photograph on her table. It was Violet, or Emily, standing before the church, laughing, her hand lifted as if waving goodbye. I hadn't seen it before. "Mrs. Cartwright sent it," Miss Marple explained. "She thought it might be better kept here, among the living." She looked at it for a long moment. "Such a lovely girl," she murmured, "and such a pity. She only wanted to come home." There was silence for a while, broken only by the soft clinking of china and the rustle of the evening breeze through the roses. Then Miss Marple said, in a tone that was almost prayerful, "People will tell stories about her, of course. They always do. But I prefer to think of her as she wished to be, not a vanished actress, but a woman who tried, however imperfectly, to find peace." She took up her knitting again, the silver needles flashing in the dying light. "We all have our parts to play," she said. "The trick is knowing when to take one's final bow." Later that evening, as I walked home through the village, I glanced back at her window. The lamp still glowed softly, and I could see a silhouette, small, serene, perfectly still, a figure of quiet understanding in a world forever spinning with folly. And I thought, not for the first time, that Miss Marple was the truest mirror of all. She reflected back the best and worst of human nature, not with judgment, but with compassion, the kind that sees everything and forgives what it can.